In the spring of 1897, on the high mesa bench above the Alder River, a lean 27-year-old frontier wife named Lena Vale counted $14 in coin and creased bills into the palm of the freight agent at Kelsey for a wagon load of bare root apple whips that the whole platform agreed, out loud and laughing, looked exactly like a cord of dead sticks. And then she drove that wagon home and did the thing that no sensible person on that bench had ever done or ever meant to do. She pulled 10 acres of prime wheat ground, the best lying ground on the whole quarter she and her husband had proved up with their own 4 hands, clean out of wheat, and she set those 300 dead sticks into the earth in long, straight, windbreak, sheltered rows. And she hauled water to them by hand off a stone boat tank, 2 barrels at a time, across ground that every wheat man in the county swore on his father's memory would never carry a living tree through its first dry July. They laughed at her for 7 years, not 1 season, not 2, 7 full years, planting to bearing, and they never once let up. They named her place the Stick Farm before her first row was even finished, and the name ran from the Kelsey elevator to the Mercantile to the church steps until men who had never spoken 10 words to Lena Vale said it easy and often, as people say a thing that has stopped being a person's home and started being a joke the whole county is in on together. Wheat was money you could bank every August, they said. Trees were money buried in the ground where only the jackrabbits could spend it. And they were still saying it, word for word, in the wet, warm June of 1904, when the streaks came up the wheat stems like dried blood, and the red rust year fell on the bench. And inside 1 fortnight, every wheat field for 30 miles went from green gold to a burnt, rust-black ruin, and the kernels threshed out gray, shriveled chaff not worth the twine to bind it, and the whole valley's cash and the whole valley's bread died, standing in 1 single season. Every field on the bench, every farm but hers. Because that same September, on the 10 acres they had laughed at for 7 years, 300 trees stood bowed to the ground under the first heavy crop of apples that high country had ever grown, and the Stick Farm was the only crop on the bench, the only living harvest in the county, and the wagons of the men who had laughed lined up in her lane with their hats in their hands. She had not gone soft in the head, and she had not gotten lucky. She was working a dead man's book. Everything she did on those 10 acres, every strange, slow, patient thing the county mocked, was written down in pencil in a water-stained ledger in her dead father's hand, and inside that ledger was a reason the rust could ruin every farm in that valley and could not touch hers. A reason so simple you will want to go back through the whole story once you hear it. I am going to tell you that reason. But not yet. Because the men at that elevator waited 7 years to learn it, and the learning is worth taking slow. Come sit with her a while first. There is a version of this story in nearly every county in this country. And the woman at the center of it is almost always the one the neighbors decided too quick had thrown good land away. Lena Vale was 27 years old that planting spring, and she was lean as a fence wire, not frail, just drawn tight and used to load. She wore her wheat blonde hair in a single work braid pulled over one shoulder, and the high sun of that country had freckled her face and her forearms until she looked, her husband said, like bread crust done just right. She went about in a calico work dress gone soft with washing and a flour sack apron with one deep front pocket, and in that pocket, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth against the sweat and the weather, she carried a book. It was a fat little ledger with pasteboard covers, water stained down one corner where a creek crossing had nearly taken it, and it was filled from end to end with a dead man's pencil, close, small, careful writing, and little drawings of buds and knives and roots, and it had come west with her in the bottom of a trunk, and it was the reason for every single thing Lena Vale did that the county could. Not understand. Her hands are worth a moment on their own. They were young hands still, but the nails were rimmed dark with orchard dirt that no washing ever fully lifted, and there was a hard, shiny callus across each palm from the bail of a water bucket, and her right thumb carried a thin white scar from a grafting knife, got when she was 9 years old and learning. And every one of those marks belonged to this story. You could read the whole of it in her 2 hands before she ever said a word. The quarter she and her husband Harlan worked sat high on the mesa bench above the Alder River, good deep ground, with the river glinting far below and 200 miles of open sky above, and it was wheat country. Or so the whole bench had decided the day the first plow broke it. The soil was right, the section lines ran gold every August, and the elevator at Kelsey stood at the end of every man's year like a church at the end of a road. That is the first thing you have to understand, the thing that made the laughter reasonable. Wheat was not just a crop on that bench. Wheat was the calendar and a bank and a religion. You plowed in the fall, you prayed through the winter, you watched the green come up in the spring, and in August you hauled your grain to Kelsey, and the man at the scales handed you the only cash money you would see all year, and that money was the taxes and a note and a shoes and a flour and a doctor. Every August, sure as sunrise. A man could hold wheat money in his 2 hands 60 days after the heads turned. A tree now, a tree, was 7 years of nothing. 7 years of taxes on ground earning not 1 nickel, 7 years of water and work poured into sticks, on the bare gamble that the stick would live in a country where the wild plums along the draws grew crooked as a dog's hind leg, and every shade tree the town of Kelsey had ever planted around the schoolhouse had died its first dry summer. That was not ignorance talking. That was 100 years of plain sense, and every man who laughed at Lena Vale was standing square on top of it and could not imagine standing anywhere else. So when the neighbors rode past that spring and saw what she was doing, they did not see an orchard. They saw a young woman on her knees in the county's best wheat dirt, tucking dead sticks into holes like a child burying spoons, and hauling drinking water to them, precious hauled water, in a country where water was work, and they saw 10 acres of prime ground that would have run 20 bushels an acre easy, standing empty of wheat on purpose. It looked to every practical eye on that bench like waste, worse than waste. It looked like a steady, capable, well-liked young woman coming quietly apart. And people are never so free with their laughing as when they have decided, out of their own certainty, that they are watching somebody they know go to ruin. The name started on the freight platform the very day she bought the whips. The agent, a heavy, good-natured man named Pearl, who meant, in fairness, no lasting harm, held up one of the bundled whips, a bare brown switch no thicker than his finger with a few pale roots at the heel of it, and he turned it in the light like a thing at auction and said, "Well, boys, $14, and shook his head slow and said, "A whole wagon load of dead sticks," and the platform laughed, and a dry little man from out east of Kelsey said, "She is going to farm sticks, boys," and one of the loafers said, "There it goes, the stick farm," and that was all it took. Pearl, who bore her no malice, leaned down as she gathered up the lines. "No offense meant, Miss Vale," he said, "but $14 is $14. You sure about this?" "I am sure, Mr. Pearl," she said. "You will freight my apples out of this same siding one day, and you will have clean forgotten you ever called them sticks." He laughed, friendly enough. "I surely hope you are right." "I am," she said, and clucked to the team and drove her dead sticks home. By Sunday it was general. Inside a month, men gave directions by it. You go on past the stick farm about a mile, they would say, and turn at the draw, and everybody knew the place they meant. And a joke rode along inside the words "free of charge." And Lena Vale heard it at the mercantile and at the church steps and on her own lane from wagons passing, 7 years of it, and she never once answered it back. She only went on watering. The name reached her own child, too, and that cut deeper than any joke on the elevator platform ever could. Her daughter came home from the schoolhouse one spring afternoon with her face swollen from crying, and Lena knelt down in front of her in the yard. "They call it the stick farm," the girl said. "They say it at me. They say my mother plants dead sticks." "And what did you say back?" Lena asked. "Nothing," I ran. Lena wiped the girl's face with the hem of her apron. "A name is only wind," she said, "unless you agree to pick it up and carry it, and we are not going to carry this one. You let 'em keep it. And one day, when those trees are hanging full, you can decide whether you care to hand it back to them." "When will that be?" "Longer than you want," Lena said. "Sooner than they think." And she sent the girl in to wash, and then she stood in the yard a while, looking at her rows of switches, and if her own jaw was tight, she let no one see it but the trees. Now I will ask you the thing this channel always asks, and I will ask it early, because this story runs long and deep as the old ones do. If you have ever stood at the edge of a piece of work you believed in and felt a whole county quietly decide that a steady, honest, capable woman had thrown good land and good money away, if you have ever been the one they gave directions by, then you already know in your bones why these stories get told slow around this fire, and why they matter. So do this for me before we go one step farther. Tell me down in the comments what county you are listening from tonight, and whether your own people ever planted a thing the neighbors laughed at. And then settle in deep and stay with Lena Vale, because the men laughing at that elevator had 7 years of laughing left in them, and after that they had a lesson coming that would outlive every man on that platform, and the whole of it. Every line of it was already written down in pencil in a dead man's hand, in a water-stained ledger in the pocket of her apron. Because here is what the men on that platform could not see, and what I am not yet going to show you. The answer to the red rust year was not in the trees. It was in the book. It was written in her father's pencil under a heading he had underlined twice. And it was one sentence long, and when I read it to you, along about the time the wheat on that bench starts to bleed, you are going to understand that Lena Vale was not gambling at all. She was the only person in that whole county who was not gambling. Hold that. We will get there together. To understand the book, you have to understand the man who wrote it. And to understand Lena, you must understand that she was not a wheat man's daughter at all. She was a nursery man's daughter. She had been raised from before she could carry a full bucket among trees. Her father was named August Renner, and he had kept a small nursery on 11 acres of southern Ohio hillside, a place of long, low grafting sheds and heeled-in rows and 1,000 young trees standing in ranks like a green militia, and he had spent his whole working life doing one thing, which was persuading apple trees to live and bear in places and years where they had no particular intention of doing either. He was not a rich man, and he was not a famous one. He was something rarer. He was a careful one. He wrote everything down. Every graft that took and every graft that failed, every root that drowned and every root that thirsted, every winter that killed and what exactly it killed and what, standing right beside the dead, came through green. 40 years of that, in pencil, in one fat pasteboard ledger, and the two that had filled before it, because August Renner held a belief that he repeated to his daughter so often it wore a groove in her, which was that a man's eyes are only on his own 2 acres for 1 lifetime, but a written page can watch 100 years. Lena was his youngest and his shadow. The older children went to the trades in the town, but Lena stayed in the rows, and by 9 she could whip graft with her own knife, which is where the white scar on her thumb came from, and by 12 she could bud in August with her hands moving and her mind elsewhere, as a woman knits. She learned the nursery as other children learn hymns without ever deciding to. And because her teacher was August Renner, she did not just learn the how of every task. She learned the why, because he would not give her one without the other. Why you plant a bare whip instead of a grand big tree, and the answer written in the ledger in his own hand, a stick is a tree that has not been believed in yet. He loved that line. He would say it holding up some pitiful brown switch a customer had sneered at, a stick is a tree that has not been believed in yet, and then he would tap the pale roots with one finger and say, and this one has more root than top, and root is the only part of a young tree that is telling you the truth. She remembered a morning in the Ohio rows when she was small and impatient, wanting the trees to hurry. Why do we cut them back so hard? She had asked him. It feels like hurting them. It is hurting them, her father said, the right amount. A young thing given everything at once dies of it. A young thing cut back to what its roots can carry lives to be old. That seems cruel. The nursery is not cruel, and it is not kind, he said. It is patient. Cruel and kind are words for people in a hurry. We are not in a hurry. We are growing trees. She had not understood it then. She understood it on a dry bench 1,000 miles away, cutting $14 whips down to bare stubs while a county laughed, and she heard his voice in every cut she made. Hold on to that line about the roots. Because 10 acres of Colorado bench ground are going to depend on it. He taught her the dry country pages, too, and this mattered more than either of them knew at the time. August Renner had spent 2 young years working nursery stock out on the droughty edge of Kansas before ever he settled in Ohio, and he had carried home from that country a whole section of the ledger that his Ohio neighbors never had one use for, pages on how you keep a tree alive where the rain forgets to come, how you plant deep and firm and mud the roots in so no air pocket kills them dry, how you carry water to the root and not the leaf, and how you carry it seldom and heavy rather than often and light, so the roots chase the water down instead of lazing at the surface. And above all, the page she would live by, the page about the crust. When rain falls on bare-worked ground, he wrote, the ground seals and cracks as it dries, and the cracks run down like little chimneys. And the deep moisture climbs up those chimneys into the wind and is gone. But if you take a harrow or a hoe or a rake and you break that crust while it is still tender, you leave a loose, dry blanket of crumbled earth lying on top, and that blanket has no chimneys in it, and the moisture stays down where the roots are. He wrote it plain, as he wrote everything, keep the crust broken, and the moisture stays home. Dust on top, damp below. A farmer who harrows after every rain is putting a lid on his own well. That is dry land orcharding, told in a kitchen sentence, and men with letters after their names would come to write bulletins about it in the years ahead and call it the conservation of soil moisture. And it was sitting in pencil inside a pasteboard ledger in an Ohio grafting shed the whole time. And there was one more line in that book, and I want you to hear it now, early. And then I want you to try to forget it as the county forgot it, because this is the line the whole story turns on. August Renner had lived through the seasons that break growers. He had seen a late frost take every peach in the county and leave the apples untouched. He had seen a caterpillar year strip the orchards naked and never touch the corn, and a corn year, a smut year, that ruined the grain men while his trees stood fat and green. And out of 40 years of watching what dies together and what does not, he had written one rule at the top of a page and underlined it twice, and the rule said this: never one crop. The year that kills one spares another. That was the whole thing. He did not write it fancy. Never one crop. The year that kills one spares another. Set it somewhere in the back of your mind, and let it sit there quiet, as it sat in the pocket of a young woman's apron on a high, dry bench where 500 families had bet every acre, every dollar, and every loaf of bread on one single grass. Because wheat, friend, is a grass. Remember that, too. August Renner died of a fever the same spring his daughter went west. And there is a sorrow in that worth sitting with for a moment, because he never saw one leaf of what she made from him. Lena was newly married to Harlan Vale, a good, steady, quiet young man with land hunger in him, and the two of them had their plans laid for a homestead out on the high bench country, and August had blessed it and had begun, in his careful way, to copy out for her the pages she would need. Then the fever came through the valley as fevers did in those days, and took him in 11 days, and Lena buried her father and her teacher in the same grave. And when the family divided the little he had, she did not ask for the clock or the silver. She asked for the ledger. Her brothers thought it a small thing to want, an old man's pencil book, stained and swollen, and they gave it over glad it was settled so cheap, and she wrapped it in oilcloth and set it in the bottom of her trunk. And that is how 40 years of a master grower's knowing crossed the plains in a wagon, riding under a bride's linens, worth nothing at all to anyone alive but her. She grieved him the whole way west, and this story is, among the other things it is, the story of what she did with that grief. Some people carry a dead father as a wound. Lena Vale carried hers as a set of instructions. Now here is the question a fair listener asks, and it deserves a fair answer. If all this knowing was just sitting there in a book, why did no wheat man on that bench have it? They were not stupid men. They were not lazy men. They read their papers and mended their machines and figured their interests close, and any one of them was worth hiring for a hard day. Why did 500 families on good ground all march together year after year, straight down the one road that could ruin all of them at once? Because knowledge does not spread like light, friend. It spreads like water. It runs down the channels that are already cut, and it pools where it is already welcome, and the channels on that bench had all been cut by wheat. A man learned farming there from his father and his neighbors, and his father and his neighbors knew wheat. So wheat is what ran in the channel. The elevator paid for wheat, so the town talked wheat. The bank lent on wheat, so the future was figured in wheat. When a county gets built like that, all of one thing, it does not feel narrow to the people inside it. it feels safe. Everybody's fields agree with everybody else's fields. Every fence line to every horizon says the same word. And the thing that everyone around you is doing does not feel like a bet. That is the trick of it. That is how whole valleys walk together into the path of a thing none of them can see. The bet does not feel like a bet when every neighbor has made it too. And there was pride in it besides, the particular pride of that age which trusted the new and smiled at the old. Wheat on the bench was the modern thing. The steel roller mill, rail car, grain exchange thing, the crop of the future. An orchard, hand-watered, hand-wrapped, worked out of a dead man's pencil book, that was grandfather farming. More than one man on that bench would have told you, kindly enough, that the country had outgrown it. It had not. There are things a county can outgrow, and there are things it only forgets, and the difference between outgrowing and forgetting is the whole distance between the top of this story and the bottom of it. So set the two of them side by side now, at the start of the 7 years, and see them plain. On one side, a whole bench of good, capable men, all planted to one grass, all sure together, each man's certainty leaning on his neighbor's certainty, like shocks of cut grain leaning in a field, so that no single man could fall into doubt without knocking the whole row. And on the other side, one 27-year-old woman with freckled forearms and a water-stained ledger, who had been taught, in the patient voice she could still hear when the wind was in the rose, that a whip is only a tree not yet believed in, that dust on top keeps the damp below, and that a season that kills the one crop spares another. They thought she was betting a folly against a certainty. She knew from 40 years of another man's watching that it was the other way around entirely. But knowing a thing and living it out are two different kinds of hard, and the living was going to cost her more than the $14. It was going to cost 7 years, worked out one bucket and one burlap wrap and one laughed at Sunday at a time, and it very nearly cost her the deed itself before the bench ever learned her name meant something besides a joke. So let us go back to the beginning of the work, to the spring the whips went in, because if you want to love this woman as I do, you have to watch her earn it. The whips came in off the railroad in late March, 300 of them bundled in, damp straw and sacking, and the weather, as if it meant to test her from the first hour, turned. A late norther came down off the high country the second day of planting, one of those iron spring winds that drop the sky to the color of a stove lid and drive grit and sleet sideways across the bench, and any reasonable person would have left off and waited it out by the fire. Lena could not. Bare rootstock is a clock that is always running. Every hour those roots spent out of the ground was an hour of their life spent, and so she heeled the bundles into a trench of moist earth to hold them safe, as the ledger showed. And then she and Harlan went on planting straight into the teeth of it. 2 days and the better part of a third, coats buttoned to the chin and sleet melting down their necks. And you should see how she planted, because there was not one careless motion in it, and every motion was her father's. The holes dug wide and not deep, wide enough that no root was ever bent around to fit, because a bent root, the ledger said, sulks for 2 years. Each whip set just so, at the depth it had grown in the nursery row, not an inch lower. And the crumbled earth worked in among the roots with her bare fingers, cold as the fingers were, so that no hollow of air was left to dry a root in the dark. A bucket of water to each hole, not to feed the tree, but to settle the soil tight around it, mudding them in, her father called it. Then the loose earth drawn over the wet like a blanket, and the whip cut back. And here is where Harlan himself, who trusted her past most men's ability to trust, stood a long moment with his jaw working, because she went down the rows with her knife and cut every $14 whip back to a bare knee-high stub, cut off better than half of what they had just bought and planted, and let the cuttings lie on the ground like the sticks the county already said they were. Ruthless, it looked. It was mercy. A whip dug from a nursery row leaves half its roots behind in the digging, and if you leave it all its top, the top will call for more water in one May afternoon than the wounded roots can lift in a day. And the tree will die of its own ambition. Cut the top to match the root, the ledger said, and the tree lives on its means. Root first, top later. Her father had a line for that, too. Of course he did. Feed the part you cannot see, he wrote, and the part you can see will take care of itself. If you want a sentence to carry out of this whole story and use on your own troubles, friend, you could do far worse than that one. She did one more thing that first spring, and it was the thing that looked maddest of all and mattered most of all. Before ever the first apple row went in, she planted the windbreaks. 2 full rows of tough, quick, rough trees, cottonwood and box elder, and a hedge line below them, set on the windward sides of the whole 10 acres. Trees nobody could ever eat or sell, planted on prime ground at the expense of ground. The elevator wits got a month of Sundays out of that alone. She is fencing her sticks with more sticks, but the ledger was blunt about it. On open plains, wind is a thirstier thing than sun. Wind licks the moisture out of leaf and soil alike. Wind whips young tops loose at the root. Wind in blossom time can strip a crop before it is a crop. Break the wind, the book said, and you have moved your orchard 200 miles east without moving it a foot. So the stick farm's first citizens were trees planted purely to stand guard over other trees. And if you had told the men at the scales that those guard rows would still be standing over that ground when every man of them was in the churchyard, they would have laughed at that too. Then came the water, and the water was the grind that made the county surest she was mad. There was no ditch on that bench, and no well worth the name up on the flat, only the river glinting far below, and a stone boat, which is a low wooden sled on runners, and on the sled a tank, and a team, and a woman. Twice a week through that first summer, and a second summer too. Lena Vale took the team down the grade to the river and filled that tank bucket by bucket and brought it up the long pull and went down her rows with 2 buckets on a yoke, a heavy drink to each tree, poured slow at the root, seldom and deep, just as the pencil said. So the roots would follow the water down instead of loafing at the top, where the first dry month would find them and kill them. Count it out for yourself. 300 trees, a heavy drink apiece, 2 barrels at a time, in July, in a calico dress, week upon week upon week. Men watched her hauling water up that grade in 90-degree heat to pour on sticks, and I will not pretend the watching was all cruel. Some of it was almost sorrowful. That is a working man's wife, a neighbor said at the Mercantile that first July. Killing herself and a good team over kindling, and Harlan ought to put a stop to it. Harlan did not put a stop to it. Harlan built her a better yoke. There was a night that second summer when even Harlan's faith bent, and it is worth hearing, because a marriage either carries a thing like this or it breaks under it. He came in late from the wheat, dust gray in the creases of his face, and sat down heavy at the table where Lena was figuring the egg money by the lamp. "Lena," he said, "I hauled 2 barrels to your trees today and let my own hay lie. The hay will be short for it." "I know it," she said, not looking up from the coins. "The whole bench is laughing at us. I know that, too. The bank is not laughing. That is the part that keeps me up nights." She set down her pencil. "Then say the thing you came in to say." He turned his hat in his hands a while. "Some mornings," he said, "I cannot tell which is worse to live under, the laughing or the note. Do you want me to stop?" She asked him, gentle, because she loved him and he had earned the asking. He was quiet a long time, long enough that the lamp guttered and caught again. "No," he said at last. "I want to be the kind of man who did not ask you to." "Then we will not speak of it again," she said, "and I will make your short hay up to you." "You always do," he said, and went to wash. He never asked again, and she never once forgot that he could have, and did not, and the trees drank his hay water 2 more summers while neither of them said one more word about the laughing at that table. And after every rain, the harrowing. This was the piece nobody on the bench could make head or tail of, because it ran exactly backwards to sense. Rain would come, one of those quick, violent bench thunderstorms, and the whole county would thank God and let the ground be. And there would go Lena Vale into the orchard rows the moment the surface dried tender, with the harrow or the wheel hoe, stirring the top 2 inches of her ground into a loose, dry dust blanket, working her dirt right after God watered it, as if she meant to undo the gift. You know why by now. Because you were in the grafting shed with her when her father wrote it. Keep the crust broken and the damp stays home. That dust mulch was the lid on her well. Every rain the wheat men banked in the sky, she banked in the ground. And the difference between those 2 banks is the difference this whole story is made of. But to the bench it was one more count in the case against her sense, the woman who watered sticks in the heat and tore up her ground after every blessed rain, and the case was getting comfortable to believe. Autumn brought the wrapping. 300 trunks, each one wound in burlap sacking from the knee down and tied with twine, because a jackrabbit in a plains winter will girdle a young apple tree in one night, wring the bark clean off it clear around, and a girdled tree is a dead tree, no appeal. So every fall, 300 wraps went on, one at a time, on her knees in the cold. And every spring 300 came off, and were rolled and kept and put on again, and that too became a joke at the scales. She knit socks for her sticks, boys. And that too was a page of the ledger executed without one flourish, and it is exactly here, in the 3rd winter maybe, that I would have you notice something about the shape of this woman's courage. It was not the courage of one grand hour. Any of us can be brave for an hour. It was the courage of 10,000 small unwitnessed chores done correctly in the face of steady public laughter, and if ever you have kept a thing alive that only you believed in, you know that is the costliest courage there is. Now it is time you met the man who was watching all of this as a cat watches a gopher hole. Because every story like this one has its mocking chorus, and then it has its one patient man who is not really laughing at all. He is calculating. His name was Merritt Crane, and he ran the elevator at Kelsey, and he was, by a distance, the biggest wheat landlord on the bench. He had come in early, bought smart, lent quiet, and gathered ground as a stove gathers heat, steady, without hurry. Without apology, until better than 1,000 acres of that high bench wheat answered to his name, and half the men laughing on his scale platform were laughing on land they rented from him or hauling grain against debts he carried. Understand him fairly, because this story does not need him to be a devil, and he was not one. He was a man of his age and his arithmetic. He believed in wheat as he believed in the multiplication table, and the Vale quarter sat square and handsome between two sections he already owned, with the best lie of ground on the whole bench, and Merritt Crane had wanted that quarter for years with the calm, unhurried want of a man who has learned that debt and drought sooner or later bring most quarters to his desk. He never mocked Lena Vale in public, not once. When the platform got going about the stick farm, he would look out that way and say nothing, or say, mildly, that it was a free country, and men took that for charity. It was inventory. Every bucket she hauled, every acre she held out of wheat, every year those trees stood earning nothing, was, by his arithmetic, one step closer to the day the Vales came to his desk. And he was a man with a gift for waiting. His wife was named Ada, and she is going to matter, so mark her. A quiet church-going woman with steady eyes, who kept her own counsel at the sewing circle when the stick farm talk went around, and who had a way of saying her husband's name, just his name, Merritt, in a certain flat tone. That could stop him in the middle of a sentence better than a lawyer could. And there was the boy, Dell, their one son, 16 that first planting spring, a long-boned, quiet boy who did his father's errands and held his father's opinions, as boys do, ready-made, and who had, though nobody had noticed it yet, including him, his mother's eyes. Keep the boy in your sight as the years turn. The end of this story belongs to him as much as anybody. The Crane's kitchen, first summer, so you can hear the shape of the thing early. Merritt at his supper, dry, amused, telling it. $14 for kindling, and now she carries the river up the hill to it. 2-3 years of that, the taxes will do the rest, and that quarter joins the east sections, and I will not have paid $1 an acre for the finest lie of ground on this bench. And Ada, not looking up from her mending, said, Merritt, just that. And he ate the rest of his supper on the quiet side, but he did not stop figuring, because saying a man's name at him can stop his mouth, friend. But it takes more than that to stop his arithmetic. Another supper, a year on, Ada tried once more. Merritt, she said, you could drive over there and offer the man your spare team for the hauling. It would cost you nothing, and it would mean a great deal. It would tell the whole bench I think there is something in it, Merritt said. And there is nothing in it, Ada. There is a woman, and a note, and time doing its work. You are so certain. I am certain of wheat, he said. I have been certain of wheat for 30 years, and it has never once failed me. Ada let it go and carried the plates to the basin. No, she said, so quiet he barely caught it. It never has. And neither of them heard, in that warm, still kitchen, how dear those 2 words were going to come. And his arithmetic, let us be honest at the fire, was not foolish arithmetic, because now we have to talk about money, real money, the kind with a due date on it, because this story is not worth telling if you think Lena Vale could afford what she was doing. She could not. The Vales carried a note at the Alder Valley Bank, taken to prove up and build and buy the team, and that note had its interest day every year as sure as Christmas, and the county had its tax day. And neither the banker nor the assessor cared one straw that 10 of the Vale's best acres were busy becoming something instead of being something. Those 10 acres had earned money every August since the sod was broken. Now they earned nothing, and would earn nothing for 7 years, and the wheat Harlan grew on the rest of the quarter had to carry the note, the taxes, the family, and the folly. All 4 every year with no slack in the rope. Sit with what that means in a bad price year. It means the difference between holding on and going under was the hen house and the churn. It was Lena's egg money and butter money, counted out in dimes at the Kelsey Mercantile, that bridged the gaps, eggs and butter sold week on week, year on year, so that a woman hauling water to 300 trees was also, at the same time, the woman whose butter was paying the interest on the ground the trees stood in. When the county said the orchard was costing her everything, the county, for once, had its facts right. The county was wrong about one thing only, and it would take the county 7 years and a ruin to learn which thing. The seasons went around, and the sticks, though the scale platform would have hated to hear it, quit being sticks. The first summer they broke bud and threw slim green shoots, and by the second year the shoots were switches, and by the third the switches were little trees, whips no longer, small heads of branches standing in their straight, sheltered rows. And the windbreak cottonwoods were already twice the height of a man, and beginning to comb the wind soft above the young orchard, and any nurseryman passing, had one ever passed, would have stopped his horse and taken off his hat. None passed. The bench saw what it had already decided to see, which was the stick farm, a joke 730 mornings old and still funny, and no crop. But not all 300 lived, and I would not tell it as if they did, because the ledger itself would shame me. Trees died. Trees die. Some drowned in a wet corner, some starved in a gravel streak, a handful the rabbits got in spite of every rap. And here is where you got to see the difference between a woman doing a strange thing and a woman who knew her trade cold. Where a tree died outright, she dug it and burned it and set a new whip from her own little home nursery bed, for she had started one behind the hen house the second spring, growing her own replacements from seed and grafting them over to the good sorts with her own knife, so she never again had to pay freight for what the bench called sticks. And where a tree lived but proved a runt or a wrong sort, she did the thing that stopped even Harlan in his tracks the first time he saw it. She cut its whole young head off and grafted a better tree onto its stump. Top working, her father called it, slips of scion wood cut in winter and kept cool in sand, then fitted and bound and waxed into the beheaded stock in spring, so that the strong wild roots below went on pumping while a better apple grew where the poor one had stood. Half the bench heard about that and knew for certain she had lost her mind entire. The woman was beheading her own trees now, and the other half never heard about it at all, because by the fourth year the stick farm jokes had worn so smooth that nobody needed new facts to tell them. She worked her knife in August, too, budding, sliding single buds under the bark of young stocks and binding them snug, her hands moving quick and sure while the grasshoppers ticked in the dry grass, and if you had stood close, you would have heard her talking, low. Not to herself exactly. To him. This row all caught, she would say to the moving air, the same as she had called it down the Ohio rows at 12. That row, 2 misses. I butted them over. And sometimes, when a graft she had feared came green in the spring, she would stand and say it out loud to nobody at all. You would have liked that one, and mean her father and go back to her knife. Grief does that when it is healed right, friend. It stops being a wound and becomes a conversation, and the ledger got its own new pages now. Her pencil under his, the daughter's hand recording the bench's lessons beneath the father's, which is how a book like that stays alive. Stand at the fence line with me at the close of the 5th summer and look at the thing plain, because it was, by then, a thing no one on the bench had ever seen. 10 acres of straight young orchard behind a green wall of windbreak, trunks clean and stout as a man's arm. The ground beneath them soft gray dust over black damp, not one weed, 300 heads of branches just coming into their strength. It was, though not a soul in the county would have used the word beautiful, and it had not yet paid 1 dime. And that is the cruelty in trees that the wheat men understood better than she liked to admit. 5 years in, the whole gamble still sat on the far side of a promise. The bench, meanwhile, had banked 5 wheat crops, 5 Augusts of cash money over the Kelsey scales, 5 years of being right every single autumn, while the stick farm was right about nothing anybody could weigh. You must be fair to the laughers here, or the story goes cheap on you. Every year that passed, their case looked stronger. Her case looked madder. And only she knew, from a dead man's arithmetic, that her case was the kind that is weakest looking in exactly the years before it is proven. And that is precisely when believing costs the most. Let me hold you here at the midpoint a moment, because the story is about to turn hard, and I do not want to lose you in the turning. If you have come this far with Lena Vale, if you have hauled the water up the grade with her, and rapped the trunks against the rabbits and heard the county count her dead trees aloud, then you are exactly the kind of soul these stories are told for. The kind that stays when a thing is only promise and no payoff yet, the kind that does not laugh too soon. Stay a while longer. The best of it is coming, but the hardest of it comes first. And she earned the best of it 1 hard season at a time. So let us not hurry past the seasons that cost her the most. The 4th summer was the borers, and it is worth a telling, because it shows you the difference between a woman playing at orcharding and a woman who had it in her hands from a girl. Flat-headed borers, the grubs that tunnel in under the bark of a young apple trunk on the sunny southwest side where the wood is heat-stressed, and they can kill a tree of that age in a season. Girdling it from the inside where no burlap wrap can stop them, and they came into her young orchard the 4th year, and she found the first of them by the little wet stain and the sawdust frass at the base of a trunk, and her stomach dropped, because a person who knows trees knows what that sign means. But she had the pages for it. Her father had fought borers 40 years in Ohio and had written the fight down, and so Lena did not panic, and she did not spray poison she could not afford onto trees she could not risk. She took a knife and a bit of stiff wire, and she went down every one of 300 trunks on her knees, tree by tree, and where she found the tunnel she cut in after the grub and dug it out with the wire and killed it by hand. 1 grub, 1 tree, 1 knee, ache at a time. And then she did what the ledger said to do against the next year's borers, which was to keep the trunks shaded and cool so the wood would not stress and call them, and she wrapped the southwest sides and whitewashed the trunks with a lime wash to throw the heat, and she saved the orchard with a pocket knife and a length of wire and a dead man's patience, and the bench never even knew there had been a battle, because the bench had stopped looking at anything but the joke. That was the trouble with being a joke, and it cut both ways, and Lena came to understand it those middle years. As long as the county had decided her place was foolishness, it did not look closely, and not looking closely, it never saw the skill. It saw a woman hauling water and tearing up her ground after rain and knitting socks for sticks, and now, if it had looked, digging grubs out of bark with a wire, and it read every one of those acts as one more proof of folly, when every one of them was in truth a master's move. There is a hard lesson in that for anybody who has ever been written off, and it is this, that the very people who have decided you are a fool will take your competence itself as further evidence of your foolishness, because they are no longer able to see it as anything else. Lena did not waste her breath fighting it. She let them see a joke, and she grew an orchard behind the joke, and there is a kind of freedom in being underestimated that she learned to use. For a woman nobody takes seriously is a woman nobody interferes with, and she was left alone with her trees and her knife and her book to do the work exactly right, which is all she had ever wanted from that bench anyway. The boy watched her through those middle years, and this is where you want to keep your eye on Del Crane, because a thing was working in him slow that would not show for years. He came by the orchard fence more than a boy running his father's errands strictly needed to. He would rein up on the section road on some pretext and sit his horse at the fence and watch her bud in August or prune in the bare cold, and he never said much, and she never chased him off, and once or twice she straightened from her work and answered a question he had not quite worked up the nerve to ask out loud, told him what she was about and why, the same as her father had told her. The how and the why together, because one is no good without the other. One afternoon he worked up the nerve to ask the real thing. He was near 18 by then, and he sat his horse at the fence while she budded, and he said it careful as if it cost him. My father says they will never bear. He says a tree on this bench is a rich man's toy. Your father is right about most things, Lena said, not stopping her hands, and wrong about this one. The trouble is, he has never been wrong long enough to learn how it is done. How is it done? She straightened and looked at him a moment. You break the crust after every rain so the wet stays in the ground and not in the sky. You pour the water deep and seldom so the roots chase it down. You wrap the trunks against the rabbits, and you wait longer than a proud man can stand to wait. That is all? That is all, she said. It is free, and it is written in a book, and not one man on this bench will trouble himself to have it. That is why it will be worth so much the year they finally need it. He rode home slow. He told his father not one word of it. But he forgot not one word of it either. He carried those answers home and said nothing about them at his father's table, where the stick farm remained a supper-time amusement, and he held two things in him at once as the young can. His father's certainty out loud, and, underneath it, growing quiet as a graft taking under bark, his mother's studied doubt about that certainty, and the memory of a woman's hands moving sure over a young tree while a whole county laughed. Seeds germinate in the dark, friend, long before there is any green to see. His was planted at that fence in those middle years, and it would come up at last in a lane one September morning with a hat held against a chest. And Merritt Crane went on circling, patient as weather. He made his second approach in the 5th year, after the bank had ridden out and the whole bench knew the note was being measured, and this time he did not come himself. He was too shrewd for that. He let it be known, through the ordinary channels of a county where the elevator man's word is half the news, that he would carry the Vail note himself, quietly, as a neighborly kindness. Buy it from the bank and hold it easy, give them room to breathe. It sounded like mercy. It was a snare, and Lena saw the shape of it at once, because a note held by the bank is a business matter with rules, but a note held by Merritt Crane would be a leash held by a man who wanted her ground and could tighten it at his own choosing, in his own year, and she told Harlan plain. We will owe the bank before we will owe that man, and they held the note where it was, harder though that was, and paid it in eggs and butter and the first thin apple money, and would not let it pass into the hands of the one man on the bench who wanted them to fail. That is a thing worth marking about Lena Vale, that she could see a kindness that was really a hook, and refuse it, and go on carrying the heavier honest burden rather than take the lighter poisoned one. Not everyone can. It is one of the quiet reasons she was still standing on her own ground the year the rust came. The money those years was always the wolf nearest the door, and I have told you the hen house and the churn were what kept the wolf back. But let me show you one trip to town, because it will stay with you better than any sum. Once a week, most weeks, Lena drove into Kelsey with her eggs packed in bran and her butter wrapped and cool, and she carried them into the mercantile and traded them across the counter for the flour and the coffee and the lamp oil and the little that a careful family bought, and took the rest in coin, dimes mostly. And those dimes were the interest and the taxes, and she counted them out and set them by at home in a tin. Once, a renter named Fessler, a man with more mouth than land, called across the store as she counted, "How's the orchard, Miss Vale? Apples yet, or still just sticks?" The counter laughed. Lena finished counting her dimes before she answered. "Not yet, Mr. Fessler," she said, pleasant as a Sunday. "Good trees and good men both take longer than you would think." That got a bigger laugh, though not the kind Fessler had wanted. And from behind the dry goods a heavy-kind woman named Orpha, the storekeeper's wife, who had never once joined the joke, said it flat. "Leave her be, the lot of you. She works harder than any three of you drawing breath, and you laugh at her because it is easier than helping her." "Nobody meant harm, Orpha," Fessler said. "You never do," she said. "That is the whole trouble with you." Nothing stopped the joke, of course. Nothing stopped it for 7 years. But Lena carried Orpha's words home like a warm coal in her apron. Because when a whole county has decided you are a fool, one plain voice saying otherwise is a fire a woman can warm her hands at for a month. And each of those trips she walked in past men who said the stick farm easy and often, and she heard it, week on week, year on year, while she counted her dimes, the sound of her own home being a joke to men who had never hauled a bucket to a tree in their lives, and she paid her note with the joke ringing in her ears, and she had never once let them see it land. You want to know what courage looks like? It does not always look like a battle. Sometimes it looks like a woman counting egg money into a tin, steady-handed, while the room laughs at her life and going home to haul water in the morning anyway. That is the courage this whole story is built on, and it is the courage nobody ever gives a medal for. And it is the most common brave thing in the world and the least sung. And should you have ever done it? You and Lena Vale are the same kind, and this fire is lit for you. If you are still by the fire, stay close now. You have watched her plant into a norther, carry a river up a hill, dress 300 trees for winter like children 5 falls running, and pay for all of it in eggs and butter and laughter. You have seen the patient man at the elevator doing his arithmetic, and the quiet wife who says his name, and the long-boned boy who watches. Every piece is on the board. And what comes next is the part I would spare her if these stories let us spare anybody. Because before the vindication ever thinks about coming, this kind of story always sends the dark years first. The years that ask a person one blow at a time. Exactly how much that promise to the dead is worth. Stay with her. She is about to earn the ending. There was a July on that bench that Lena Vale never once spoke of afterward without going quiet in the middle of it, and it came in the second summer, before the trees were anything a person could point to and call an orchard. The rain simply stopped. 6 weeks it stopped, and then 7, and a wind came up out of the south with no more moisture in it than the draft off an open oven door, and it blew day and night until the grass on the open bench went from grain to the color of a paper sack and stayed that way. The river itself pulled back from its banks and ran low and warm between widening bars of dry stone, so that the hauling that had been hard became cruel, the team fighting soft footing for every barrel and Lena carrying the buckets farther out over the gravel to reach water at all. And in the worst fortnight of it, when the trees needed her twice a day and could get her once, Lena Vale took a fever. It laid her flat for 8 days. She would tell you later she remembered almost none of it, only the ceiling boards and the terrible dry sound of that south wind in the eaves and her own voice, she was told, asking after the rose in her sleep. Harlan did what one man could. He hauled, and he poured, and he sat up with her, and he ran the wheat besides, and he could not be 3 people. And no man could have been. And when Lena came back to herself and got up thin and shaking and walked out to the orchard on Harlan's arm 8 mornings later, 90 of her young trees were dead. Curled brown, leaves crisp to ash flakes that fell at a touch, bark going loose on the little trunks. 90, nearly a third of all she had. She did not weep at the fence, though I think she had earned the right to. She walked the rows slow, touching the dead ones, and she counted them once to herself. And then she went in and she wrote the number in the ledger under her father's, 90 lost, the dry, and the cause of it, and beside the cause she wrote the remedy for next time, in her own hand, which is what her father would have done, because a Renner did not mourn a loss until she had first learned from it. But do not let the calm fool you. That was the closest the drought ever came to finishing her, and it was not the trees dying that nearly did it. It was the Sunday after. Because the bench had heard. Word of a die-off travels a rural county faster than word of a wedding, and that first Sunday Lena was well enough to be up. The wagons came out the bench road, and they slowed at her fence, and they counted her dead trees out loud. Not cruelly, most of them, which was somehow the worse of it, just certain. A wagon would rein up, and a man would stand in it and shade his eyes and go down the rows with his finger in the air, and Lena weeding her home nursery bed behind the hen house where they could not see her, would hear it carry across the still hot air. "I make it near 100 gone," one voice said. "Told you," said another. "You cannot farm sticks on this bench, and you never could." And a woman's voice, kindly, worst of all, said, "Poor thing, somebody ought to speak to Harlan." Then the wheels would take up again, and the next wagon would come. She knelt in the dirt behind the hen house with her jaw set and her father's book in her apron, and let them count, because there was nothing to say to people who had come out on a Sunday for the pleasure of watching a promise fail, and because if she stood up they would see her face, and a Renner did not give them that. That was the summer Merritt Crane made his first move, and he made it gently, which is how a patient man moves. He drove out himself alone on a cool evening after the worst of the heat had broken, and he sat in his buggy by the end of the Vale Lane with his hat in his lap and waited to be asked up, which Harlan did, because you did not leave a neighbor sitting in the lane, not even that one. Crane would not come in to supper. He sat on the porch step and turned his hat and admired the sunset a while, and talked about prices and the railroad and Ada's rheumatism, and only when he rose to go did he mention, as if it had just occurred to him, that he knew times were close, and that he had always thought highly of this quarter, and that if ever the Vales wished to be shut of the worry of it, he would make it easy for them. A fair figure, cash, and no shame in it, a man could start again clean somewhere with money in his pocket instead of a note around his neck. He named the figure. It was less than the ground alone was worth, and both men knew it, and it did not include one dead penny for 7 years of trees. Harlan, to his credit, did not answer it. He said they would keep on a while yet, and thanked him for the neighborly thought, and Crane said, of course, and drove off well satisfied, because a low offer refused is not a failure to a patient man. It is a seed planted. He would let it grow. Lena watched the buggy lamp go down the bench road from the dark of the kitchen window, and Harlan came in and told her the figure. And she was quiet a long moment, and then she said only, "He does not want the trees. He wants the ground the trees are standing on, and he is willing to wait for it." And she was right, and that was the whole of Merritt Crane in one sentence, and she went back to her mending. The years ground on, 3, 4, 5, and the trees that lived grew, and the orchard began at last to look like the thing she meant it to be, and still it did not bear one apple worth hauling to town. A young tree in its 4th and 5th year will set a few, a handful, a taste, and those first apples she gave to the school children by the pocketful, so that at least the children, who had chanted the stick farm at her own daughter, would carry home in their own mouths the fact that the sticks made fruit. But a handful is not a crop, and the note did not care, and it was in the 5th year that the bank rode out, and that was a harder day than any wagon load of Sunday counters. The banker's name was Ostrander, a decent enough man who carried other men's futures in a leather book and had learned not to let his face show what he thought, and he came out at the bank's asking, not his own, because the note was a long way along and the ground behind it was earning nothing a ledger could show. He walked the orchard rows with Lena in the 5th year spring, and I will say this for him, he was no fool. Nor was he blind. He saw the clean, stout trunks and the swept dust of the mulch and the green wall of the windbreaks, and some part of him, the farmer his father had been, knew he was looking at good work. But good work is not the same as good collateral, and he had to say what he came to say. "When does it earn, missus?" That was the question plain. When does this ground carry the note again, as wheat carried it? And Lena told him the truth, because she always did. 2 years, she said, maybe 3 to a full crop. They are near their bearing age now. And Ostrander wrote something in his book and closed it and looked out over the rows a while, and then he said the thing that stayed with her. He said, "I hope you are right, missus, because the bank cannot lend against hope, and 2 more years is a long time to ask a note to wait on faith." And he tipped his hat and rode back to Kelsey, and he did not call the note, not that year, but she understood that he had come out to measure her for the calling of it, and that the measuring had begun. That is the thing these stories are honest about, friend, if they are any good at all. It was not one grand dark night that nearly broke Lena Vale. It was the slow accumulation of ordinary weight, the dead 90, the counting wagons, the patient man's low offer sitting out there like a lamp in the dark, the banker's book closing, the egg money stretched to a wire. 7 years of her own daughter growing up as the girl from the stick farm, and under all of it the plain grinding fact that every single August the bench was proved right and she was proved nothing, over and over in cash at the Kelsey scales, while she had only a dead man's book and her own stubborn hands to set against the whole weight of it. Anyone would have doubted. She doubted. The measure of her is not that she never doubted. It is what she did with the doubt when it came for her all at once, which it did. In the spring of 1904, on the morning the wind took the bloom. For that spring, at last, the orchard bloomed as an orchard is meant to. 7 years she had waited, and that April the trees that had been dead sticks and then switches and then little heads of green stood up and covered themselves in blossom fence to fence, pink fading white, so thick the branches looked snowed under. So sweet the whole 10 acres hummed with more bees than the bench had ever seen in one place, and the perfume of it carried clear to the house on the evening air. It was the first sight in 7 years that made the gamble look like anything but folly, and even a wagon or two slowed on the bench road that spring, not to count the dead, but to look. Because there is no arguing with 10 acres of blooming apple trees, they are simply beautiful, and a few of the harder faces softened just to see it. Lena walked those rows in the blooming dusk with her father's book against her heart, and let herself, for the first time in 7 years, believe clear down to her boots that she had won. The crop was set. She could see it in the bloom. This was the year. That evening she said it to Harlan on the porch, the pair of them watching the bees work the last of the light. 7 years, she said. Do you know what this one crop pays off? The note, Harlan said. The note and the back taxes and something over besides. And the laughing? The laughing does not pay off in money, she said. That one pays off in apples on their own tables come winter, and it will, and I do not mean to say one word when it does. You have earned a word or two. I have earned the quiet, she said. The quiet is the better prize. You will see. Then, the last week of April, the wind came. Not the killing south furnace of the drought summer, but a hard 3-day blow out of the west. A spring gale that drove down off the high country and hit the bench broadside. And it came at the 1 hour the orchard could least afford it, full bloom, petals barely fallen. The tiny set fruit no bigger than a shirt button and holding to the twig by a thread. The windbreaks took the worst of it, and thank God for them. For without those unglamorous guard rows planted 7 years before, at the expense of ground, she would have lost every apple on the place. But no windbreak stops a 3-day gale entire. And when it blew itself out on the 4th morning, and Lena went out into the gray light with her heart in her throat, the ground under the trees was littered with the little wind-torn beginnings of her crop. And she walked the rows, and she saw that better than half of what had set was down in the dirt. Half her first true crop, 7 years in the making, blown off in a night. And that was the morning, friend, that Lena Vale came the closest she ever came to signing the deed. I will not pretend otherwise. She stood in the wrecked bloom with the wind still moaning in the windbreak tops, and she did her father's cruel arithmetic. Half a crop off young trees is a light crop. A light crop after 7 years of nothing does not pay a note the bank is already measuring to call, and Merritt Crane's cash offer was still standing out there in the dark, easy, clean, a way out. She thought about her daughter. She thought about Harlan's face doing sums at the kitchen table by the lamp. She went back to the house and she took the deed out of the trunk where it lay folded beside the place her father's ledger had ridden west, and she set it on the table, and she sat down in front of it, and she was, for one long morning, a woman about to quit. What turned her was the book. It is always the book in this story, and this time it was a line she had read 1,000 times and needed, that morning, to read as if for the first. She had opened the ledger to write the loss, half the set, the west wind, as she wrote every loss, and her eye fell on the page above it. The page her father had headed and underlined twice, the one crop page. The page she had carried up and down that bench for 7 years, and she read the margin note he had penciled small beside the rule, a thing he had added late in a shakier hand near the end. Do not measure a tree in the year of a hard wind, he had written. Measure it in the year the wind spares it. A tree is a promise you keep with more than 1 year. And under that, smaller still, the plainest thing he ever wrote to her, and the thing that got her up off the chair. It is not a wheat field. You do not lose it all in a day, and you do not win it all in a day. Prune and wait for next year. She folded the deed back into the trunk. She did not sign it. Instead, she went out in the clearing weather with her saw and her knife, and she pruned. She took out the wind-broken wood and shaped what was left for the crop to come. And she walked her home nursery bed and lifted young trees she had grown herself, and set them into the few gaps the years had left. And she did the patient, forward-looking work of a grower who has decided, against a night of good reasons to quit, to keep her promise to the dead 1 more season. Half a crop was still a crop. It was still, though she could not yet know how much, more apples than that bench had ever grown. And it was ripening on the twig, small and green and holding, all through the wet, warm, strange June that came on the heels of that windy spring, the wettest, warmest June the old-timers on the bench could remember, a June that made the wheat men glad. Because a wet, warm June is money in the wheat, and made Lena Vale, watching her fruit swell, quietly grateful too. Neither she nor they yet knew that a wet, warm June is also the one thing above all others that a certain red disease of grasses waits for, and that it had been waiting in the stubble and the wild grass of that all-wheat bench for a June exactly like this one. Hold there. Take a breath with me, because we have come to it now, the turn the whole 7 years was pointed at, and I want to tell it slow, the same as it happened, so that you feel it break over that bench the same as they did. The wheat that June was the finest anyone on the bench might remember. That is the part you have to hold in your mind first. Because the cruelty of what came is not in a bad crop failing. It is in the best crop anyone had ever grown being taken at the very edge of the harvest, after all the work and all the cost, when the money was as good as in the hand. The wet, warm weather that swelled Lena's apples had done even more for the grain. The wheat came up thick and stood tall and headed out heavy in green gold across every section of that high bench, fence line to fence line, horizon to horizon, a sea of it moving in the wind, the kind of crop a man farms his whole life, hoping to see once. At the Kelsey elevator they were already talking prices and rail cars. Merritt Crane rode his 1,000 acres that June with the quiet, deep satisfaction of a man watching arithmetic he has trusted his whole life come true 1 more time, more true than ever. And if he thought of the stick farm at all, it was only to reflect, mildly, that the poor woman's apples would fetch a few dollars at a roadside this fall, and that it changed nothing, the note would still come due. The ground would still come to him, and the good wheat all around her only proved again what the bench had always known. The wheat was going to make every family on that bench whole and then some. And then, in the space of a single fortnight, it did not. It was a boy who saw it first, one of the hired boys out walking a field on the east sections, and he came in and told his father there was a rust on the wheat, and the father went and looked and was not troubled at first, because a little rust late in the season is a common thing and mostly harmless, a light dusting on the leaves that the crop outruns. But this was not that. This came up out of the stems themselves, along the straw, at first in scattered streaks, and then in long broken lines. The green skin of the stalk split open from beneath, and out of the splits pushed a raised, rusty red blister, brick-colored. And when a man ran his thumb up the stem, the blisters broke and left his thumb powdered a bright foxy orange. A fine dust that blew off his hand into the wind and was gone, carrying, though not one soul on that bench yet understood it, the seed of the ruin to the next field, and the next, and the next. The old-timers went pale before the young men did, because a few of the very oldest had seen it once before, far away and long ago, and they knew its right name. And its right name went down the bench road faster than any horse. The red rust, black stem rust, the wheat killer. It moved as fast as fear, faster, because fear at least has to be told, and the rust told itself, riding its own orange dust on that warm wet wind from stem to stem and field to field. A field green gold and glorious on a Monday would be streaked and angry by Thursday. And by the Monday following it would have gone over entirely, the straw no longer gold, but a dark, ugly rust, black, choked and strangled from the stem out, and the whole field would have a scorched, sick look to it, the color, more than one of them said, and none of them ever forgot, the color of dried blood. And the horror of it was not in the leaves or the color, it came in the head. For the rust does its killing by robbing the plant, choking the stem, so the plant cannot carry up out of that ground what the swelling grain needs, and so the kernels, just at the tender milk stage, when they should have been fattening hard and heavy toward harvest, simply quit. They shriveled. They pinched down to little gray shrunken things, light as chaff, rattling dry in a head that should have been heavy enough to nod. A man could take a head that looked from the road near enough to ripe and roll it into his two palms and blow the chaff away, and be left standing there with a pinch of shriveled gray nothing in the crease of his hand where there should have been a palmful of hard plump wheat. That was the moment it broke men, that pinch in the palm, and it happened in 1,000 palms across that bench inside of 2 weeks. They cut what they could, some of them hoping, and the threshing only made it certain and worse, because the machine does not lie. The straw went through, and the grain came out the spout light and thin and gray, a trickle where there should have been a flood, and what did come was so pinched and shrunken it was fit for nothing, not for milling, not for seed, hardly for the hogs. Some of them stopped their binders in the midst of a field and simply sat, as a man sits when a thing he cannot mend has happened, and let the team stand, and looked out over acres of standing ruin that it would cost more in twine and labor to cut than it would ever return. All up and down the bench the binders stood idle in fields that from a distance still looked like a crop, and up close were a graveyard. The Kelsey elevator, which every August had roared and dusted and lined the road with loaded wagons, stood that August nearly silent, its scale still, its men standing in the door with nothing to weigh. The whole cash of the valley, the whole bread of it, the taxes and the notes and the winter flour of 500 families, had died standing in the field in a fortnight, from a dust that blew off a man's thumb. At the elevator the talk had gone from prices to prayer, and then to a thing worse than prayer, which is the flat arithmetic of ruin. "I owe the bank $400 against a crop that is gone," one man said, to nobody. "Everybody owes everybody," said another, "and not a soul has got it." A young farmer stood in the doorway with a fistful of shriveled heads and kept saying the same words over. It looked fine a week ago. It looked fine a week ago. Nobody answered him because it had looked fine to every man there a week ago. And looking fine only a week past was worth exactly nothing now. And somebody at the back said, "Lo, the thing that would travel the whole bench by nightfall. The only green left standing on this whole bench is them apple trees we've been laughing at." And the elevator went very quiet. And Merritt Crane, 1,000 acres. Understand what that meant for him, not as a devil brought low. For I told you he was no devil, but as a man of pure arithmetic watching the arithmetic itself turn on him and eat him. Every acre he had gathered so patiently, every quarter he had waited debt and drought to bring to his desk, all of it was staked on the one crop, all of it was that same wheat, and the rust did not care that he was the biggest man on the bench. The rust took the big field the same as the small one. It took his 1,000 acres exactly as thoroughly as it took the poorest renter's 80, and stood him, at the finish of that fortnight, a man owed money by half the county that now had nothing to pay him, and owing money himself against a crop that no longer existed. He rode his ruined sections in a silence very different from June's. And on one of those rides, near the end of it, Merritt Crane came up the section line that ran along the west fence of the Vale quarter, along the very windbreak Lena had planted 7 years before at the cost of ground. And he stopped his horse because he had to, because of what was on the other side of that fence. There was, on his side of the wire, 1,000 acres of rust-black ruin, straw the shade of a scab, heads full of gray chaff, the finest crop of his life turned to a thing not worth the cutting. And on her side of the wire, not 30 feet away across that green wall of windbreak, the trees the whole bench had called dead sticks for 7 years stood bowed to the ground beneath the weight of apples. Not a few apples, not a roadside handful. A crop, a true heavy first crop, come into its bearing at last, boughs pulled down in long green arcs and propped up off the ground on forked sticks so they would not break under the load, and the fruit hanging in it thick, deep red and honey gold, coloring up sweet in that same warm sun that had ripened the rust, taking that same wet June that had killed his wheat and turning it into the best set of fruit a young orchard could throw. It rubbed no orange dust off on any man's thumb. It stood there, heavy and clean and alive, the only living harvest for 30 miles in any direction a man cared to ride. And Merritt Crane sat his horse at that fence a long time and looked at it, and no one will ever know everything that went through him. But we know he did not speak. And we know he turned his horse at last and rode home the long way around, so that he would not have to pass the Vale Lane. Now I am going to keep the promise I made you at the start, back before the whips ever went in the ground, because you have waited for it as long as the bench waited, and you have earned it more having stayed. I told you the answer to that rust year was not within the trees. It lay in the book. And here it is, the one sentence her father underlined twice, made plain at last by the ruin all around it. Rust is a disease of grasses. That is the sum of it. That is the secret the ledger held for 7 years in a woman's apron pocket while a county laughed. Black stem rust is a living thing, a fungus, and like every living thing, it eats what it is made to eat and can eat nothing else, and what it is made to eat is grass. Wheat is a grass. So is oats, so is barley, so is rye, so is the wild grass in the fence rows and the volunteer in the stubble, all of them grasses, all of them the same green family. All of them one single table set for the one hungry disease. The rust lives on grass, and travels from grass to grass and dies without grass, and it cannot, no matter how thick it blows, no matter how wet the June, take hold of a plant that is not a grass. And an apple tree is not a grass. An apple tree is as far from a blade of wheat in the deep kinship of growing things as a horse is from a fish. The orange dust that strangled acre upon acre of Merritt Crane's wheat could settle on the leaves of Lena Vale's 300 apple trees as thick as it liked, and do nothing at all, find nothing there it could eat, and blow on. The disease that ruined the bench simply had no door into her orchard. There was never any door. And now you see the second half of it, the half that turns a piece of luck into the wisdom of a dead man, because it was not luck, and the ledger is why. Look again at what that whole bench had done. Fence line to fence line, horizon to horizon, section after section after section, the bench families had planted the very same thing. One crop, one grass. They had made of that entire high bench a single unbroken table for any disease of grass that ever came along, so that when one did come, on one warm, wet wind, it did not meet a field here and a field there with something else between to slow it. It met one continuous grass 30 miles wide, and it ate straight across it, because they had built it a road. That was the folly. Not any one man's folly. The whole bench's folly, the folly of everyone agreeing, the folly of a county so sure of one thing that it planted nothing else across its whole width, so that the year the one thing failed, everything failed together, in the same fortnight, from the same dust. Her father had watched that pattern play out over 40 years and 40 crops in another country. One disease sparing what another killed, and he had written the plainest rule he knew across the top of a page and underlined it, that a grower who plants only one thing has bet his whole life on no disease of that one thing ever finding him, which is a bet no grower wins forever. Do not stake it all on a single crop, he had written, for the season that takes that crop takes everything you have. Lena Vale was the only soul on that whole bench who had not made the bet, not because she was luckier than her neighbors, because she had read and believed and paid for 7 hard years, a thing that was set down in pencil and free for the reading, and that not one of them had ever had the patience to read. There was the dry orcharding besides, and do not let it be lost in the larger marvel, because without it there would have been no trees alive to be spared. It was one thing to know that a tree would sidestep a grass disease. It was another thing entirely to keep 300 trees living and thriving on a dry, high bench long enough to find out, in a country that had killed every shade tree the town of Kelsey ever set out. That took the windbreaks that moved her orchard 200 miles east without moving it a foot. It took the deep, seldom heavy watering that sent the roots down chasing the moisture instead of loafing at the top for the first dry month to kill. It took the dust mulch stirred into the ground after every rain, the lid on her well, so that the water the wheat men banked in the sky, she banked in the ground beneath her trees. It took the burlap against the jackrabbits and the knife that cut the tops to match the roots and beheaded the runts and grew a better tree onto the stump. 7 years of a dead nurseryman's craft, executed by his daughter's 2 hands against a whole county's laughter, is what stood those trees up strong enough to bear a heavy crop in the 1 year the bench most needed a crop to bear. The rust decided which farm would be spared. But it was August Renner's pencil and Lena Vale's hands that decided there would be an orchard standing there to be the one. So there it was, plain at last for anyone on that bench with eyes to add it up. On the whole of that high mesa, in the rust summer of that year, exactly one piece of ground was bringing in a harvest. And it was her 10 acres they had named the Stick Farm itself and given directions by for 7 laughing years. The apples came ripe in a flood that September, more fruit than one family could pick. And Lena Vale stood among her bowed and propped and loaded rows in the early cool of a picking morning. In the calico and the apron, her braid over her shoulder and her father's book against her heart, and she looked at what the pair of them had made, and she did not say a word, and she never need to. The whole county was about to come up her lane and say it for her. Harlan asked her the plain question that first loaded morning, the both of them standing among the propped and bowing rows. "Why us, Lena? Why did ours come through when the whole bench went down together?" And she told him the things she had known for 7 years together, and had never been asked out loud. "Because the rust feeds on grass," she said, "and wheat is a grass. And this bench is nothing but wheat. We are the only farm that planted a thing which is not grass. The rust never had a door into this orchard. That is all of it? All of it," she said. "We planted 2 things where they planted 1, and the season that took the one could not lay a finger on the other." Harlan looked out over the fruit a long while. "Your father," he said. "My father," she agreed. "Dead near 8 years, and righter than the whole living bench. The first to come was not a man at all, or not yet a man, and that is fitting, because in these stories it never is the loud ones who cross first. It was the boy. Del Crane, who had been 16 and long-boned and full of his father's ready, made opinions the spring the whips went in, was 23 now. A grown young man with his mother's steady eyes, and he came up the Vale Lane on foot, alone, early, before the wagons, in the gray of a September morning, while the dew was still on the fruit. He had walked. He had not brought a rig, because a rig would have been seen and asked after, and he stopped toward the end of the lane and took his hat off his head and held it against his chest with both hands, and he waited there until Lena came out from among the trees with a picking sack over her shoulder and saw him. And what he said to her is the thing said in every one of these stories by the one who crosses first, and it was true when he said it as it has ever been true. "My father didn't send me," he said. "He doesn't know I'm here." Lena set down her sack and looked at him a good long while, in that still way of hers that people had once taken for slowness, and she said no hard word, because she had never once in 7 years spoken sharp to a soul about any of it, and then she was not going to start with the one boy who had walked out alone to stand in her Lane hat in hand. She asked him what he had come for, and Del Crane looked past her at the trees bent to the ground with their impossible crop, the only living crop on a bench of ruin. And his voice was not quite steady when he answered, because he was old enough now to understand exactly what he was looking at and exactly what his whole world had gotten wrong. "Teach me," he said. "Teach me how you did it. The trees. I want to learn to graft. I want to learn all of it. I don't want to farm like we farmed, not after this." She did not answer him right off. "Grafting is slow," she said. "It is knives and waiting and mostly failing and being laughed at while you fail. Your father will not thank me for teaching you. My father is ruined," Del said. "Everybody on this bench is ruined but you. I would rather learn the one thing that worked." "That," said Lena, "is the first sensible thing a Crane has said to me in 7 years." And Lena Vale, who had buried her teacher and carried his book up and down that bench for 7 laughing years, with no one at all to give it to, no student, no shadow of her own, as she had been her father's shadow in the Ohio Rose, looked at this boy standing in her lane asking to be taught, and something in her that had been held tight for 7 years let go, just a little. And she said, "Well, come in out of the dew then, and I will show you the knife." And that is how the teaching passed on. At the beginning of it, one young man with his hat against his chest, in a lane, at first light, in the thick of the ruin of everything he had been raised to believe. Mark it, because a method that dies with its keeper is only a story, and a method that finds a student is a future. And the distance between those two things walked up that lane on its own 2 feet that morning and asked for the knife. Then the wagons came, and they came for weeks. Word of an orchard in heavy bearing on a bench where every field of grain lay dead does not stay quiet, and it did not, and the bench road that had carried the counting wagons out on Sundays now carried a different traffic. Wagons and buggies and men on foot and children with baskets, coming up the Vale Lane and standing in it, 3 and 4 deep some mornings, waiting their turn. They came for apples. They came because the wheat that was to have been their winter flour and their cash and their taxes was gray chaff in the field, and here, at the place they had named that farm, was food, real food. Bushels and barrels of it, sound-keeping apples that would carry a family through a winter, and cider that would keep, and apple butter that would keep, and they came, many of them, in a kind of shame they did not know what to do with, hat in hand, up the lane of the woman they had given directions by for 7 years, to ask to buy what they had laughed at her for growing. And this is where you learn the whole size of Lena Vale, because a smaller soul would have made them pay for the laughing, and the market would have let her. She had that September the only apples in 30 miles, in a valley whose own harvest had failed entire, and a hungry county with a failed crop is a county that will pay anything a seller cares to ask. She could have named famine prices. Not one buyer could have said her nay, and not one, in fairness, would even have blamed her. For that is only the market, that is only what a short supply and a long want will do to a price, and every grain buyer who had ever squeezed a farmer in a hard year had taught the whole bench that this was simply how the world was made. Lena Vale did not do it. She set a fair price, a good honest fall price, the price her apples would have brought in a year when everyone's crop came in fine, and she held it there. The same price for the man who had counted her dead trees out loud on a Sunday as for the woman who had brought her daughter home crying from the schoolyard chant. The same price for Merritt Crane's renters as for her own few friends. When a man tried to press money on her over the fair price, out of guilt or out of the simple habit of a market where you paid what a thing would bring, she would not take it. "This is what they are worth in a fair year," she said, more than once, "and this is a fair year for apples, whatever it has been for wheat," and she would count him back his change. One old man who had laughed as loud as any stood turning his hat at her wagon and could not get his words to come. "Miss Vale," he said at last, "I said hard things about you, for years, out loud, where you could hear." "I know it," Lena said, and set 2 bushels in his wagon bed. "That is the fair price, and not a penny more." "I did not come only for the apples," he said. "I came to say I was wrong." "You can say it," she said, "or you can plant 10 trees this spring and never say it at all, and I would think the better of the second one." He planted 40 that April, and never did say the words, and never once did she made him. A young mother came up the lane with 3 children and not much in her purse, and she counted her coins twice at the wagon, and Lena watched her count them. "How much will this buy?" the woman asked, holding out what she had. Lena looked at the 3 children in the wagon bed. "That buys a bushel," she said, "and this sack of windfalls goes along with it for the young ones to eat on the road, no charge, because windfalls will not keep and children will. I did not come here for charity." "It is not charity, it is windfalls," Lena said. "They would rot in my yard by Sunday. You would be doing me a favor hauling them off." The woman had no words for it, so she only nodded and loaded her children and her bushel and her free sack and drove off. That same scene played out, in one shape or another, 100 times in the Vale Lane that fall. And she fed the school first and the sick, before she sold a barrel for cash to anyone. That was the first thing she did. Before the wagons even, the very week the fruit came ripe. She sent apples to the schoolhouse by the crate for every child, the children who had sung the Stick Farm chant at her own girl. Because a child who is hungry through a failed crop winter does not learn. And Lena Vale had decided a long time ago in her own heart what she would do first if this year ever came, and it was feed the school children who had mocked her. And she did it and said nothing about it. And she sent baskets to the homes where there was sickness or age, or a new baby or a man laid up, the homes that a failed harvest would grind hardest, and she sent them quietly, by Dell or by her own daughter, with no note and no price and no accounting, so that some families on that bench ate her apples all that winter, and were never entirely sure whose kindness they were eating. Which is the only way a proud people will let themselves be helped, and Lena knew that too. The cider press ran in her yard from first frost near to Christmas. Harlan had built it and rigged it, a good screw press, and the culls and the windfalls and the apples, too bruised to keep, went into it. And the yard smelled of crushed fruit, and the sweet must ran. And she pressed cider for anybody who brought their own kegs, and gave it where giving was needed. So that a bench with no wheat money at all still had, that hard winter, something sweet for the children and something to trade among themselves that was not the failed grain. And the apple butter kettle, the great black kettle, swung over a fire in the yard through the cool, bright days of that fall, and the women came. The same women from the sewing circle who had said poor thing about her over their mending across 7 years, and they stood around Lena Vale's kettle and stirred it in turns with the long wooden paddle so it would not scorch, all day, the cider boiling down with the apples and the spice into a dark, sweet, keeping butter that a family could set on bread all winter. And they filled their crocks and carried them home, and something happened around that kettle that a whole county's apology at the elevator could never have managed, which was that the women who had counted her out found themselves, hour on hour over a slow fire, simply working beside her, and it is very hard to keep laughing at a woman while you are eating what her patience grew and stirring her. Kettle with your own 2 hands. Merritt Crane came last, and he came in public, which cost a proud man more than you might think, and I will give him this at the foot of his story, that when the reckoning came, he did not hide from it. It was at the elevator that he said it, the Kelsey elevator, standing idle in an August with nothing to weigh, where the laughing had first started 7 years before on the day a freight agent held up a dead stick and named her farm. The men were gathered there as ruined men gather, with nowhere to work and nothing to do but stand in the shade of the thing that had failed them and talk it over, and Crane was among them, no longer quite the biggest soul on the bench in his own eyes or theirs. A landlord owed money that could not be paid on ground that had grown nothing, and one of the younger men, sour with loss, said something bitter about the stick farm woman getting rich off the ruin, selling apples while good men went broke. And Merritt Crane turned on him, and the men went quiet, because when Crane spoke, men still listened out of long habit. And what he said loud enough for the whole platform to hear. "She is not getting rich," Crane said. "I have asked. She is selling at a fair year price in a famine year, which not one of us would have the character to do, and she fed the school before she sold a barrel, and she is not the fool here." He stopped, and it was quiet, and then he said the harder thing, the thing that was the real apology, because a man of arithmetic apologizes by admitting the arithmetic was wrong. "I called that woman a fool for 7 years," he said, "and I wanted her ground, and I was wrong. I was wrong the whole 7 years, and she was right, and she had been right for a reason that was written down, and that any one of us could have read if we had not been too proud to read a woman's book. We planted one crop, fence to fence, the whole bench, and I planted more of it than any man here, and the year it failed all of us at once. And there was one soul on this bench with the sense not to do it, and we called her the fool." He put on his hat. "I am done laughing," he said. "I have got no right to it." And he walked out, and no man on that platform said a word against her again, then or after. He never got the quarter. That is worth saying plain, for the patient predator does not always fall, but he does not always win either, and Merritt Crane did not win. The apple money and the cider and the reputation of the only producing farm on the bench were enough when Ostrander the banker came out again to change the whole color of that note, for a bank lends against what earns. And Lena Vale's 10 acres had become, in one September, the surest earning ground in the county, the one piece of it that a failed year could not touch. Ostrander walked the loaded rows a second time, and this time he did not ask her when it would earn. He asked her, a little sheepishly, whether she would be selling Scion wood come spring, because his own brother-in-law was talking of putting in trees. The note was safe. The quarter stayed Vale ground, and the trees stayed on it, and Merritt Crane went home to Ada and to the long, slow work of climbing back from the whole 1,000 acres of ruin like every other farmer on that bench. The difference being that his own son now walked out 3 mornings a week to the Vale orchard to learn the knife, and Crane, to his credit, let him go. Ada came too once on her own, and I will tell it because it is small and because it matters. She came with a crock to be filled at the apple butter kettle like any other woman, and she stood beside Lena stirring a while, and when her crock was full, she did not go right off. She said, "I told him, years back. I told him to go over there and offer to help you instead of waiting to buy you out." And Lena said she knew, that she had always known there was somebody in that house on her side. And Ada said, "For whatever it is worth now," and Lena said, "It is worth the same as it ever was," which is a good deal, and the 2 women stood by the fire a moment with nothing more that needed saying, and then Ada carried her apple butter home. That is how a conscience gets thanked in these stories. Quietly, over a kettle, between 2 women who both already knew. The learned man came the next winter, and with him came the thing that turned a local marvel into a lasting knowledge, which is the last and highest turn these stories take. Word of what had happened on that bench. One orchard standing through a rust year that took a whole valley's grain, traveled the same as such word does. up the rail and into the towns, and it reached at last the State Agricultural College, where such things were the very meat of a man's work, and the college sent out a professor to see it for himself. His name was Hollis, a spare, gray, careful man with spectacles and a notebook of his own, and he had meant to stay a week, and he stayed the winter, because what he found on that bench was better than he had been told. He walked the rows with Lena in the bare, cold months when an orchard shows its bones, and he asked his questions, and she answered them plain. And then, because he asked, and because he was the first man in 7 years with letters after his name to ask her honestly, instead of telling her, she showed him the book. He asked her the question the college had sent him to ask, standing in the bare orchard with his coat collar up against the wind. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "every field of grain in this district failed, and your trees did not. I have my own notion why. I would rather hear yours." Lena told him the same as she had told the boy at the fence, plain and unhurried. "The rust lives on grass," she said. "Wheat is one of the grasses, and this whole bench is wheat, so the whole bench was one long dinner table set for it. My trees are not grass. There was never a place at that table for them." Hollis wrote a while, then looked up. "And who taught you that?" She laid her hand flat on the pasteboard cover of the ledger. "My father. He has been dead near 8 years. He is still teaching. That is what a written page is for." Hollis was quiet a moment. "Would you let the college print it so other men can learn what this bench learned the hard way?" And Lena thought of the failed grain and the wagons and the children she had fed. "Print it," she said, "but you will print his name on it, not mine. I only kept the book. He is the one who wrote it." I would give a great deal to have seen Professor Hollis's face over that ledger, a lifetime of a working nurseryman's watching set down in pencil, the grafts and the dry country pages and the dust mulch and the deep watering, and across the top of one page, underlined twice, the plain rule about never staking a whole living on one single crop. He read it, they say, most of one night, at the Vale kitchen table by the lamp, and in the morning he asked Lena Vale if he might copy it, and she let him, and he sat there days copying a dead Ohio nurseryman's book into his own hand for the college. And out of that winter came a bulletin, a real printed bulletin of the kind the college sent to every farmer who would have one. And it laid out the size of it in the sober language of the college, the windbreak that shelters a dry bench orchard, the tillage that conserves the soil moisture, the deep and infrequent watering that roots a tree against drought, and, set out, clearest of all, because it was the lesson the rust had taught in blood, the plain grave warning against planting a whole country to one single crop of one. Single kind, lest one disease of that kind undo it all inside a season. The bulletin did not call it the stick farm. It named the method, and it named the place, and it named her, gave her name in print as the grower whose orchard had come through the rust year when the grain of the whole district failed, and it credited, in a line she must have read 100 times. The nursery ledger of her late father, kept in Ohio over 40 years. He had said it himself, all those years before, in the grafting shed. A man's eyes are only on his own 2 acres for one lifetime, but a written page can watch 100 years. He had been dead near 8 of those years, and his page had just started watching. And here is the thing I mean for you to carry out of this story more than any other, the picture that says it all. When the college held its field day the next summer, its demonstration day, When the professor brought farmers from 3 counties out to that high bench to see the orchard and hear the method and take home the bulletin, they nailed the notice of it up, printed and public, on the wall of the Kelsey elevator. The very same elevator. The same board wall where 7 years of men had leaned and laughed and said the stick farm easy and often. The same platform where a freight agent had held up a dead stick to start it all. That was where they nailed up the notice inviting the whole country to come and learn what the woman they had mocked knew. Lena Vale did not nail it up herself, and she would not gloat when it went up, and there is no scene in this story where she stands on that platform and tells those men what they can do with their opinions, because that was never in her, and because it was not necessary. The notice on the elevator wall said it. The wagons in her lane had said it. The bulletin with her name in it said it. Merritt Crane had said it out loud in the shade of his own ruin. She did not have to say one word, and she never did, and that is the dignity these old stories are really about, under the apples and the rust. It was never about making them sorry. It was about the truth finally standing up in public where it could be seen, and a good woman being allowed, at last, to be seen along with it. The spring after the rust year, the bench changed, and it changed for good, which was the legacy this story leaves and the reason it was worth 2 hours of your evening to hear. That spring, Orchard Rose went in on farm after farm up and down the high bench, because a man who has watched his neighbor's trees bring in the only crop of a ruined year does not need to be asked twice. And where did the trees come from, and where did the knowing come from? From her. Lena Vale cut scion wood all that winter, from the best of her own trees, the ones her father's book and her own knife had proved, and she gave it and sold it fair to any neighbor who wanted to graft his own. And she went out in the cold days and showed them how, and Del Crane went with her more than once to help, the boy who had crossed the lane first now teaching the knife himself. And the ledger, the water-stained pasteboard ledger that had crossed the plains under a bride's linens worth nothing to anyone alive but her, got copied out by hand, page by page, for neighbor after neighbor, until there were a dozen copies of August Renner's 40 Years of Watching scattered across a bench that 7 years before had not owned a single fruit tree worth the name. The bench never again planted itself all to one grass, fence to fence. It had learned, the hard and only way a whole county ever learns anything, that you do not stake every acre and every mouth on one single crop. And it planted its orchards and its gardens and its mixed fields from that year on, and the windbreaks Lena had set out to a county's laughter became the pattern that other windbreaks copied. And somewhere in all of those changes was a line out of a dead man's hand, still doing its patient work 1,000 years faster than one man's eyes ever could. Lena Vale grew old on that ground. The trees she planted as dead sticks grew into a real orchard, a famous one in that small country, and outlived the laughter and outlived the laughers, and outlived, in the end, Lena herself, as a good orchard is meant to do, for that is the whole difference between a wheat field and an apple tree, and this is the difference her father had tried to tell her, and she had spent 7 years proving. A wheat field is this year's bet. An orchard is a promise you make to years you will not live to see. She had planted at 27. 300 promises into ground a county swore would kill them, and she had kept every one she could through drought and rabbit and wind and 7 years of being the joke the bench gave directions by, and in the 1 year it counted, above all others, those promises had stood up green and heavy and alive over a valley of ruin and fed the very people who had laughed. And then they had gone on standing and bearing and teaching long after the laughing was forgotten and the rust was a story the old men told. That is not a story about apples, friend. It never was. It is a story about what patience is for. So let me leave you where these stories always ought to leave you, with the fire burning low and one thing to carry up to bed. Somewhere near you there is a piece of ground, or a piece of work, or a person that the sensible people all around have already decided is a waste, a folly, a bet against the sure thing. And maybe they are right. But maybe, just maybe, somebody has read a thing the rest have been too proud or too hurried to read, and is out there right now, quietly hauling water up a hill to something that looks like a dead stick, keeping a promise the whole county is laughing at, waiting on a year that has not come yet. If this story found you tonight, I think you already know which kind of person you are. If you have made it this far with Lena Vale, clear from the wagon load of dead sticks to the notice nailed on the elevator wall, then do this before you go. Subscribe and stay with this fire, because there is one of these stories in every county in this country, and we are going to sit with every one of them we can find. Tell me down in the comments the name of the one where you live, the steady soul your own people laughed at too soon. And then answer me this one last thing, the question the entire bench had to answer the year the rust came, and a question every one of us answers sooner or later, whether we mean to or not. When the hard year finally comes, would you rather be the man who planted with the whole crowd and lost with the whole crowd because it felt safe to agree? Or would you rather be the one soul on the bench who read the book, kept the odd hard promise, and had something green still standing when the rest lay ruined in the field? Think on it, and sleep well, and come back to the fire, because there is always another story, and it always starts the same, with somebody the world was too quick to laugh at.